All right, so ready to dive into the world of Doctors Without Borders.
Absolutely. Always ready to talk about MSF.
You shared some research with us about precarity and MSF.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff.
So for people who aren't familiar, what does that even mean? Precarity.
So it's more than just like job insecurity. It's really this feeling of uncertainty that can impact so many parts of an aid worker's life.
Okay, so less about like the actual job, more about the whole experience of working with MSF.
Exactly, yeah. Like think about the emotional impact, the constant moving around, the financial strain. It's a lot to handle.
Makes sense. So with this deep dive, where should we even start?
I think the researchers did a really smart thing by focusing on the stories of individual aid workers.
Oh, so like getting a real feel for what it's actually like on the ground.
Exactly. Like there's this one story about a young doctor right out of med school decides to volunteer for um, what MSF calls the desert year.
Desert year. Okay, that sounds kind of ominous.
Well, it can be intense. Basically, it's this period of like intense learning. You're living on a really small allowance.
You're putting your life on hold back home.
Exactly. And sometimes even giving up things like unemployment benefits.
Wow. So you really have to be committed to this kind of work.
You do. And for some people, it's harder than others, especially if they're already dealing with financial stress.
Right, like that security blanket just isn't there.
And the research actually talks about aid workers who come home after these missions and they face like housing insecurity or mental health challenges. It's really tough.
That's heartbreaking. To dedicate yourself to helping others and then to feel so lost when you come back.
It is. And it really highlights those long-term effects of precarity we were talking about.
So it's not just about like being okay with a little uncertainty.
No, not at all. It's about having the support to deal with it. And that's actually a really important point because the research found that not everyone experiences precarity the same way.
So some people are better equipped to deal with it than others.
Exactly. Like if you're a surgeon, for example, surgeons, anesthetists, those specialized skills, they're always in demand, even within MSF.
So they have more leverage.
Absolutely. They might be able to skip that desert year altogether, or even just do these short contracts.
It's like a working vacation, but instead of beach, it's well, not a beach.
Right, right. The research even uses this term expat parenthesis. Like it's just a blip on the radar of their normal life.
Expat parenthesis. Okay, I kind of like that. So it's almost like a more intense form of volunteering.
In a way, yeah.
Yep.
And it really shows how much privilege plays a role. Like if you have a comfortable life back home, you can afford to be more flexible.
That makes sense. It's easier to embrace uncertainty when you have that safety net.
Right. And that leads us to another big factor that the research looked at, social capital.
Which, remind me again, is all about
It's who you know,
that.
the connections you have within MSF,
Hmm.
like mentors who can help you.
Or colleagues who will recommend you for a certain project.
Exactly. It's all about those informal networks. They can really make a difference in who gets the, shall we say, better assignments.
And I imagine those networks can be even more important in a field like this, where things are constantly in flux.
Oh, absolutely. Like imagine waiting for your next assignment. You don't know when it'll be, where you'll go. It's tough.
Especially with the added financial stress a lot of aid workers are under.
Right, exactly. It makes you wonder who actually thrives in that environment. Like who
Yeah.
actually chooses this life?
Right. It seems like it would be a hard life to sell.
And yet, the research found some people see MSF's structure as, get this, a source of freedom.
Really? Okay, now I'm intrigued.
There was this one story that really stood out. An aid worker uses his time off between missions to travel, pursue his hobbies. He's like, this is the life.
So instead of a burden, precarity is like an opportunity.
It's about perspective, right?
I guess if you can swing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. Not everyone can. Like,
Yeah.
if you don't have that safety net, that family support, it's a whole different story.
Yeah. So precarity can be a privilege in a way.
The research definitely suggests that. Like, even just where you're from can make a difference.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, aid workers from countries with MSF offices, they often have more stability. They might be able to work closer to home.
That familiarity must make a huge difference.
Oh, for sure. And then there's family support. Like we were saying, having a family to help with childcare, elder care, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, if you have to constantly worry about those things.
It's another layer of complexity. And it highlights that not everyone within MSF starts on a level playing field.
Some people are just better equipped to handle the uncertainty.
Right. It's like that saying, it takes money to make money. Sometimes it takes privilege to navigate precarity.
And we don't always think about it that way. We tend to focus on the financial aspect of privilege, but it's so much more than that.
Exactly. And that's what makes this research so compelling. It challenges those assumptions. Like, there are even cases where aid workers from the global south, they were actually better off financially while working with MSF than they would be back home.
Interesting. So even though they might be earning less in absolute terms,
Their money goes further. They might have lower costs of living, family support.
it's about the whole picture, not just the number on your paycheck.
Right. And I think that's a really important takeaway from this whole conversation about precarity. It's not one size fits all. We have to consider the whole context, listen to the experiences of aid workers from all backgrounds,
Because their stories can teach us so much about the systems at play.
and hopefully help us create a more equitable and sustainable model for humanitarian work in the future.
It's almost like we're seeing this kind of behind the scenes look at how MSF actually works.
Yeah, and it's complicated, right? You have all these individuals who are drawn to MSF's mission, but then the organization itself is this huge entity with its own constraints.
Like, I imagine it's a constant balancing act for them.
Totally. And one of the things that the research really highlights is this tension that's starting to emerge
Between.
between the organization and the aid workers themselves.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, for a long time, MSF has relied on this model of like self-sacrifice, people dedicating years of their lives, often at a personal cost.
Yeah, we've seen how demanding it can be, especially in those early years.
Right. But now, as more aid workers are gaining experience, they're starting to demand more autonomy, better conditions.
They're not just content with, like, doing their part anymore. They want to see real change within MSF itself.
Exactly. And that's creating this whole new set of challenges for MSF. Can they adapt to these changing expectations? Or will they lose those experienced aid workers to organizations that are willing to offer more?
It's like MSF is at a crossroads.
In a way, yeah. And it made me think, what does this mean for the future of humanitarian work as a whole?
Right, like, is this model of self-sacrifice even sustainable?
That's the big question. And I don't think there are any easy answers. But I do think it's something we need to be talking about more openly and honestly.
So it's not just about celebrating these, like, heroic acts of service anymore.
No, it's about having a more nuanced conversation. It's about acknowledging the challenges, the sacrifices, and finding ways to better support the people who are doing this really important work.
Because ultimately it's about the impact, right? If aid workers are burned out, disillusioned,
It's going to affect the quality of care they're able to provide. And that's not fair to anyone, especially the people they're trying to help.
it feels like this research is kind of a wake-up call, in a way.
I think so, yeah. It's a call to action for MSF and for everyone working in the humanitarian field. We have to do better. We have to find ways to make this work more sustainable for everyone involved.
Because the world needs MSF. It needs those dedicated individuals who are willing to go where others won't.
It does.
Hmm.
And it's our responsibility to make sure they're able to do that work without sacrificing their own well-being in the process.
It's about finding that balance. The idealism, the passion, those are important, but they need to be supported by structures that allow people to thrive, not just survive.
Beautifully put. And that's a good note to end on, I think. This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive.
It has. And to our listeners, we hope this conversation has sparked some new ideas, maybe even some healthy debate. Keep those conversations going because the more we talk about these complex issues, the closer we get to finding solutions.
Couldn't agree more.
Until next time, this has been The Deep Dive.